Okay, so here is a short little summary of our job description for a prophet from our class. So I normally ask my kids, if they wish that God would talk to them, directly, like if they could just hear His voice. And everybody always wishes that, and I do too. But when we read in the Old Testament, we see that originally, yes, God did just straight up talk with His voice. If you think Adam in the garden, the Lord spoke directly to him, or even Abraham getting the promises, it was the Lord's voice. Fast forward to Moses in the burning bush, the Lord is talking to him directly. But there's a pretty significant event that happens in Exodus 19 and 20, where God has delivered the people of Israel, and they're standing at Mount Sinai, and the Lord gives the 10 Commandments. And if you actually read it in chapter 20, the 10 Commandments are said with God's voice. And the people, when they hear it, are so terrified that they think they're going to die from the power and glory of God on the mountain and this sound of His voice. And when you read about the mountain, there's fire on the mountain, there's thunder and lightning and these big old horns going off while He's talking. And God said, like, if you touch the mountain, you're going to die. Okay, so the people actually request the role of prophet from Moses. They tell Moses, they say, Moses, please, have God talk to you and you talk to us. If we keep hearing the voice of God, we're going to die. And so Moses agrees, and the Lord uses this role of prophet seemingly from that time on. So the purpose of a prophet in the Old Testament is a go-between. It's a messenger to point people to God, or to relay a message to God, to the people from the Lord. Typically, when we think of the idea of a prophet, we think of somebody standing on the street corner with a sign that says, the world's going to end at this date or whatnot. And the prophets did talk about the future, and what the Old Testament prophets, they did talk about events that would occur. They made predictions, but that was a minority of their ministry, that foretelling aspect. The primary role of their ministry was a forthtelling type of speaking, where they would speak or write to God's people in need today, and they would talk to them about what to do to obey today. So if you think of like at a funeral for one of the staff members at our church, the preacher kept pointing his talk directly to the family sitting down on the front row, and he kept speaking to them like these truths about the story of Lazarus, and he was encouraging their hearts for today and helping build up their faith for this difficulty that they were facing. And it was so powerful. And that type of speaking forth the word of God is more what the Old Testament prophets did on a regular basis. They spoke for a difficulty or a need or a sin pattern at this day, and how to help what God thought of it today. And really, if you think of it, it makes sense, because all we have is today. And the Lord really spoke forth telling more, because foretelling, it takes longer to come true, but the foretelling did show that the Lord was outside of time, and that He knew what was going to happen. He could arrange it. He could be sovereign over it, as opposed to idols that could not, that were lifeless and they were not in control. Okay, so then we talk about the difference between false prophet and true prophet. Okay, just because someone tells you that God told them something, right, you can't just necessarily believe it. The Bible tells you not to believe it, but to test it and to make sure. And that's one of the things that I like about Christianity a lot, is that they aren't promoting naivism. They are promoting faith, but it's only after really careful thought and examination. So there are people that are false prophets. They will tell you that they are from God. And the Bible paints a portrait of what they're like so that you can beware of them. They would typically be paid or be given certain things that benefit them in order to speak a certain message. They would be soft on sin, to tickle the ears of their listeners, to make people happy. Their audiences would be like taking in what they say. They would like it, but then they would also think, wait a second, that kind of goes against what the Bible had said. It wouldn't like be affirmed by what the Lord had spoke before. Or if a false prophet makes predictions and they don't come true, that's a great way to know that they were not speaking from the Lord at that time. Their character also, their moral character, would show what they were like as well. I must do anything. So a true prophet is going to be different. They're more like a true friend versus a friend that is like a fair weather friend, or a friend that tells you what you really need to hear versus one that just tells you what you want to hear. A true friend is going to tell you things even if it hurts, because they love you more than they love you being happy with them. A prophet is going to be sent from God to tell you truth about, mostly in the Old Testament, about obeying. That the Lord wants you to give up your sin and embrace Him in relationship with Him instead of these spiritual lovers. So these Old Testament prophets that were from the Lord, is interesting. When they were picked for their job, they were often overwhelmed at the thought that they would be chosen. They don't think that they're worthy or capable, but God picks them anyways, and they go even whether or not they like it. Think of Jonah, even like Jeremiah thinks he's too young. But God produces this fire in their bones with His message that they will go and tell. And so what they say is often like authenticated by miracles that they can do. If you think of Elijah or Elisha, they had lots of miracles and power that showed that they were really talking from the Lord. Often a true prophet talked about Messiah, and that's a big theme in the major and minor prophets. The audience, just like when a true friend tells you something hard, often they didn't like it. And the lives of the prophets are filled with persecutions and difficulties in them trying to love people with truth. In John, it talks about people not loving the light. 1 John, not loving the light, but loving the darkness. And when the light comes, they just resist it because it shows their evil deeds, and that often occurs in the prophets. But not everyone, and a lot of people that were in need, that is their lifeline. It's their hearing from the Lord, and that's where they were changed and loved. So even though the prophets that we'll study don't seem to be too successful because a lot of people reject them, it wasn't because they weren't good prophets. It was because the hearts of the hearers are really hard. And if you think about how much you do want a true friend, that's how you need to open up your heart to these prophets, even if it's hard messages for you yourself to hear. They are only speaking these things because the Lord knows that you need them. So when we look at future prophets, the Old and New Testament, the Old, minor and major prophets, we want to accept the things that or maybe our areas of weakness, because the Lord is speaking, and He is the one that cares about us the most, even at great cost to Himself.